Hello and welcome to the Com 498 show. I'm Tony Palmeri from the Communication Studies program at the University of Wisconsin, Oshkosh. More than 20 years ago, I was producing and co-hosting a television program for Titan Television here at UW Oshkosh called Commentary. And that show was always directed by student directors. And one of the best student directors I worked with was a student named Nathan Wardinski. And Nathan went on, he was a radio TV film major. He was a minor in English and philosophy, been a lover of film his entire life. He hosts a really spectacular radio program and writes movie reviews for The Sound of Cinema. I'll put links on this show. And most recently, Nathan has written a scholarly book about the very controversial 1980 film called Cannibal, Holocaust, directed by Ruggero Deodato. And this has been one of the most notorious films ever made. It's inspired lots of horror and slasher type films. So Nathan's book is called Dissecting, Cannibal, Holocaust. It's published with Lexington Press. Nathan, thank you for being here today.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Great. Let's start off with, can you give us maybe just like a brief synopsis of what the 1980 film Cannibal, Holocaust is about?
Sure. So this film is part of a cycle of cannibal movies that were made at this time, mostly by Italian filmmakers. Cannibal Holocaust begins. Documentarians have disappeared in the Amazon while filming an ethnographic picture about cannibalistic tribes. And so a anthropologist is sent down into the jungle to find out what happened to them. He follows their trail and meets the natives and eventually discovers that the documentarians are dead, but that their footage remains. And so in the second half of the film, we watch their news footage and find out what, in fact, happened to the documentarians.
Okay. And this has inspired things like, I'm sure many viewers of this will be familiar with, say, the Blair Witch Project.
Yeah, so it's part of that genre. And it was often cited as an inspiration on the Blair Witch Project. Now, it wasn't. The filmmakers of Blair Witch have said they didn't actually see or were even aware of Cannibal Holocaust at that time, and I believe them. But it is a really important title in the history of horror and of found footage.
Okay. Now, I've seen Cannibal Holocaust largely because you and I have talked about it over the years. What got you interested, maybe not just in Cannibal Holocaust, but in this genre? I know you're a big watcher of the horror film genre. What got you interested in this genre of film?
Well, I've always loved horror, and I think there's a variety of reasons for that, some of which some of it gets down to the fact that I wasn't allowed to watch R-rated movies as a kid. Some of it is the creativity of the genre and the potential of it, because it just offers so many avenues for creativity and expression. And I think as I've gotten older, there's scholarship around horror cinema that suggests Bruce Cowan wrote a famous piece called The Mummy's Pool. And in this essay, he argues that horror films are like nightmares for the culture. In the same way that we have nightmares and it's our psyche working out the stuff that is bothering us, we tell horror stories as a way of the culture dealing with whatever it is that's bugging them. And sometimes that's very topical stuff. Sometimes that's more deep-seated, psychological things, or somewhere in between. And for that adds a whole nother layer onto what horror films can do and what they can mean.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the introduction to your book, which by the way, I have not read the whole book, but it's extremely well written.
Thank you.
You talk in your introduction about how you first engaged Cannibal Holocaust at around the same time, you were engaged with Michael Moore's Bowling for Columbine, and that's a movie,
Yep.
that's Michael Moore's film about gun violence in America.
Hmm.
What's the connection for you of those two films?
So I actually saw them the same weekend. I had ordered a copy of Cannibal Holocaust. It may have been pirated. I don't have it anymore, but it was a VHS tape that I bought off eBay because Grindhouse Releasing had not yet put out its DVD copy yet. It was a couple of years off. So I watched Cannibal Holocaust. Uh, it arrived in the mailbox the same weekend that Bowling for Columbine was playing at the theater, and I went to see both. And what's fascinating about this is, for one thing, watching Cannibal Holocaust just against the background of the post 9/11 era and seeing um, some certain parallels. So, right at this point, we were in this midst of a lot of complaints about media being dishonest, not doing their jobs, as far as the WMD disaster was concerned.
Right?
And Cannibal Holocaust is partly about um, the violence that exists between cultures, but it's also about the corporate element of our interactions with the developing world and the industrialized world. Now, as far as Bowling for Columbine is concerned, um, that film ended up being an interesting complement with Cannibal Holocaust because Michael Moore was critiquing the media and the way that it has advanced certain narratives, namely racist narratives. And that's one of the things Cannibal Holocaust is about. It's about the way that we have constructed certain narratives that run through both, fiction film, but also nonfiction and ethnographic pictures.
Hmm.
Um, and but then also with Bowling for Columbine, and then later on with Fahrenheit 9/11, there was a lot of controversy in the press about the editing techniques that Moore used and the way that he phrased things that were not always completely honest.
Hmm. Wow. So you definitely saw the connection there.
Hmm.
The director of Cannibal Holocaust, Ruggero Deodato, in your book, do you find evidence that he was aware that he was making some kind of political statement, or did he just see this as mere entertainment? How did the director himself see what he was doing?
Yes. So um, there's two people that are really important to the authorship of this film. One of them is Deodato, and the other is Gianfranco Clarici, who is the screenwriter. Now, as far as Deodato is concerned, in interviews, he's talked about how he had been living in Italy, and in the 1970s, the Italian society was besieged by political violence, in particular, the violence of the Red Brigades.
Right.
And he was watching what was happening on television, and he was upset in part because he made movies, some of them violent, and had trouble getting his stuff through the censors. Meanwhile, this extremely violent footage was being shot and broadcast on television where his son could see it. And so he was very upset about that. He also had some suspicions about the integrity of some of that reporting, that it was being manufactured or otherwise distorted by the press in the name of
Hmm.
ratings.
Wow. And what about the screenwriter?
So the screenwriter has not uh, Clarici has not done a lot of interviews. He's not talked publicly about a lot about this.
All right.
Um, but it is clear from having read the script that Clarici did do his homework and had read some of the research, most popular research about the Yanomami people of the Amazon.
Hmm.
In particular, he had read the books of Napoleon Chagnon. I was able to identify certain keywords that he used in his descriptions that maybe don't necessarily make sense in context, but indicate that he must have read these books.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Now, it's easy to watch Cannibal Holocaust and simply dismiss it out of
Mhm.
hand as excessive violence, maybe racist stereotypes
Mhm.
of indigenous people, misogyny, violence, real violence against
Mhm.
animals, right? Actual
Yes.
killing of animals, not just simulated. You seem impatient with so-called critics who would just dismiss a film out of hand. Is that a fair assessment of your
Yeah,
view?
yeah,
All
yeah.
right. So
Well,
what
and
what
that's true of any film. I don't want people to just dismiss stuff. I think they
right.
should engage with it.
So what would be your response to people who would say this is just all those things I just mentioned?
Mhm.
Excessive violence, racist, misogynist, the whole nine yards. What would you say to them?
I guess I could say that description also applies to Apocalypse Now. It does, and but that's dealing very superficially with what's on screen, right? There's a lot more going on in the film than that, and I think the noise of the violence sometimes has turned people off from engaging with it, and I understand that. But I think there's been also, especially in the popular press, they've dealt with the film lazily and
Yeah.
not
Let's
really
play
tried
on
to.
that for a second, Nathan.
Sure.
What maybe just in general, what is a lazy critic? Because this is something that as a professor I engage this where I see
Yeah.
people who are only comfortable with thinking about any text
Mhm.
to a certain point and then they won't go any further. I would call that lazy criticism. What do you mean by this?
Yeah. So I think the job of viewers, and especially people who've taken on the role of critics, is to engage with the film, and that requires understanding the history of, the form, also the history of the genre. Um, all genres also have certain politics associated with them. So, again, my book, I talk about Westerns because Westerns are the origin story for the United States.
Hmm.
And wrapped up in that is a lot of other political meanings as far as that have to do with race, among other things. Um, and we have to understand those things and see it in that context, and then also to really look at what filmmakers are doing. Now, films are just like any other art form. Most of them are going to be mediocre.
Yeah.
That's just the reality of things, right? Exceptionalism is the exception. But I think what I what I get angry about with film critics is when it's clear that they haven't thought through and are not thinking about the choices of the filmmaker. Instead, they've slotted this into a particular genre. This is what this film does, and maybe I have a pre-existing prejudice for or against that genre, and that's as far as I'll address it.
Right. See, my understanding, Nathan, of what a responsible critic should be doing is helping his or her audience, the critic's audience, see something in the text
Hmm.
that is not immediately on the surface, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
that on the surface, all we see in Cannibal Holocaust is grotesque, horrific violence against anything and
yeah,
everyone. But you seem to be saying that there is something else there.
right.
So
And I don't
what is the something else there?
Yeah, and I don't even think it's that far beneath the surface. The film's pretty blunt about some of the stuff that it's doing, but you don't come to a film named Cannibal Holocaust for subtlety. You know.
Right.
So what is Cannibal Holocaust actually about? Well, um, again, looking at the film in context, this movie is playing on storytelling traditions that go all the way back to colonial literature. You look at something like Robinson Crusoe and Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. It definitely descends from those stories. It also, in terms of film, has relevance to the jungle adventure films that were being made in the 1930s,
Hmm.
to the history of the Western, and to various kinds of documentary filmmaking, among them ethnographic filmmaking, and especially Mondo films, which were a specific kind of documentary produced mostly by Italian filmmakers in the 1960s and 70s, and really
Yeah,
into the
Mondo
80s.
Cane was one
Mondo
was
Cane is the signature title. That was the really the first one.
okay.
And what I find interesting about Mondo is that now Mondo was kind of specific to that era, and then the other major title in that would be Faces of Death, which comes out in the late 70s and into the 80s. And that's where Mondo takes a turn and becomes ever more fabricated and debased.
Mm,
Although I think you can see traces of Mondo going forward, in for example, the Girls Gone Wild video series that was popular in the 90s and 2000s. And then it's interesting looking at that genre in particular going in the present era, in the era of YouTube videos and Instagram and OnlyFans and all that.
right.
But I'm getting ahead of myself here. The as far as what's happening in Cannibal Holocaust, what's the meaning of all this? Um, it's playing on that narrative tradition, and it is then messing with it and pointing out some of the assumptions that we've had. Uh, it also is a film about cinema itself and the limits of cinema and the form and the way that it works. Uh, and it's also about, for example, the place of human beings in the world as far as nature is concerned, our relationship to nature and humankind's place in it.
Right. Now, you did a video, I'll put it in the description of this show, where
Mhm.
the title of your video was Should You Watch Cannibal Holocaust? And I thought
Yeah,
you did an outstanding job of laying
thank you.
out what's involved in film watching. But in that video, Nathan, you do say that people probably should not watch a version of the film that edits out the actual killings of the animals, which, by the way, I found those scenes to be just beyond right, shocking.
Yeah, they're tough.
Yeah, they're really really tough, especially the scene with the turtle. That I
Mhm.
think I had nightmares over that for about a week. But why do you think if people are going to watch Cannibal Holocaust, they need to see the version that includes even the animal killings?
Well, partly because that is what Cannibal Holocaust is. That is integral to that film. I've made a comparison in that video between the edited version of Cannibal Holocaust and versions of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn that have the racial epithets removed. But
Right.
once you've done that, you've kind of missed the point. In the and that's, I think, an important thing about the animal killings in Cannibal Holocaust is that they're not just extraneous violence. They actually serve a filmmaking purpose. The special effects artist Tom Savini has talked about how when they would do gags in slasher movies, one of the things they would do is if the villain had a machete, the
Mhm.
villain would hit that machete against a hard surface and take a chunk out of it, like a piece of wood, and that would give the thing credibility before the next shot, which is when the weapon goes into the face of the victim, right? And it creates a credibility for that weapon that translates in the viewer's head and makes the effect work. Well, Cannibal Holocaust is doing something like that. It's got these real life deaths put next to the simulated human deaths, right?
Mhm.
And that footage, makes us believe in the reality of the human deaths much, much, much more. There's also, I think, a statement being made here, which is that it suggests that the value of the animal's life and the value of the human being's life is equivalent. You mentioned the turtle scene, and I find that one really interesting. One of the characters who takes the lead in disemboweling the turtle is Jack, who's the blonde-haired photographer. Uh,
Mhm.
at the end of the film, he dies. Spoiler. And this way that scene is shot actually uses imagery that is remarkably similar to the footage of the tortoise being killed.
Oh,
So it even uses the same musical piece at the time.
wow.
And so it's drawing these connections between one and the other that I think is really interesting and is going beyond just grossing us out.
Yeah, I think that's very insightful. And you got me thinking the fact that the animal killings in the film make the simulated human killings seem more real
Mhm.
is that not one of the reasons why some critics at the time believed that this was a quote unquote snuff film? A snuff film is one in which people are actually being killed, right?
Yeah, yeah, and snuff is kind of a weird phenomenon, and that's something that was happening in the culture at the time. Um, some people believed that some of the stuff that they were watching was real,
Right.
uh, just as people believed that the Blair Witch Project was real when it
Exactly.
came out. Um, but yeah, I think that the animal killings were what got them into the most trouble, which is interesting because the movie contains a sequence called "The Last Road to Hell." We're shown a documentary that the film crew had previously made, and we watched this for a brief while, for a couple minutes, and that footage is all real. That's
Oh,
actual news footage that had been shot and that they used. Some of it comes from the Idi Amin documentary from the 70s, but it shows actual executions of real people, um, that was then repurposed by the filmmakers. But then we're told by the network executive, "Oh, this is all fake. This was all put on for the cameras, uh, by the filmmakers." And that makes, I think it's an interesting wrinkle on the film when we're told that that stuff is fake, but we probably know that that stuff is actually real. And so you can read
wow.
into that in different ways. Is it actually fake, or is in fact, that what the network executive is telling herself, for putting that stuff on the air?
Oh, wow. Let's talk a little bit about the legacy of Cannibal Holocaust. I mean, by analogy, Jimi Hendrix in rock and roll was a spectacular guitar player,
Mhm.
but he did spawn a lot of really, really bad imitators, right? It wasn't
Yeah,
his fault, right? But some people grab hold of a technique
sure.
and then they just don't do it. Is something roughly analogous with Cannibal Holocaust? I mean, you seem to be suggesting that it does represent a, a very classic production in a particular genre. Has it spawned a lot of really bad imitators?
Well, what's interesting is that Cannibal Holocaust has inspired imitators, but they've come much later. So, this movie came out in 1980, and it was in the midst of a whole wave of cannibal movies, which really starts in 1972 with Umberto Lenzi's Man from Deep River, and then continues. Rogerio Deodato makes a movie called Last Cannibal World, which was also titled Jungle Holocaust in some releases. And um, those movies were pretty straightforward, stories of white people into the jungle, getting captured and terrorized by native people, and then usually a survivor escapes. And that's how most of these films worked. There was also the sort of jungle princess movies in which a white woman would be captured by the cannibalistic tribe and then held by them as their like queen. And
Right.
that has traces you can find back in like the Tarzan films, right?
Right.
Um, but so there was all these films coming out. Cannibal Holocaust is the most famous. It's probably the best made, and most notorious of these movies. But um, I think what we've seen since then is some people making uh, knockoffs of the picture. There was a film called Welcome to the Jungle, which was made in the late 2000s, which was
Hmm.
done in a found footage style, about people in the jungle looking for a famous person who has disappeared, and is very obviously working on that. We've seen tributes to it in other films. Most recently, there was the PG-13 King Kong movie, Kong Skull Island, which was full of references to other movies. And one of them actually is a reference to the impaled woman image from Cannibal Holocaust. It
Wow.
was worked into this PG-13 movie, which I found amazing. Um, and then actually, there's a lot. If you go on Spotify or any of those services and you put in the title Cannibal Holocaust, you'll find a bunch of heavy metal and death metal songs with that title being used for their pieces of work.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Let me back up for a second. What was it about the 1970s that gave birth to this cannibal genre? Was it just like an era of just shock in film? I mean, for example, hardcore pornography
Hmm.
really has its high point
Yep.
as a theatrical phenomenon in the 1970s. Is this somewhat in that same ballpark?
Oh, I think so. I think that there was something that was happening culturally and industrially at this time. One is there was a relaxing of the censorship laws, which I
Mhm.
really centered over around pornography. And in Italy, in particular, this is where this was happening. Uh, there was and there was a real fight between sort of the conservative forces in society that were trying to rein in some of these excesses and filmmakers who were pushing boundaries. I think
Mhm.
there's some political stuff that's happening in the background too, which is, for example, the Vietnam War and the last vestiges of colonialism are, you know, falling apart. And um, I think there's a reaction to those events as well that's happening here in these films. And as well as just, I mentioned Deodato watching the Red Brigades, that plus Vietnam being broadcast into people's homes in a way that hadn't happened before and really hasn't happened since.
Right.
And uh, the violence that was being seen, cinema had to keep up with those things. And I think all this stuff kind of melded together and gave us, this cultural moment resulted in this work.
So, do you think that Deodato, the director, is his own legacy pushing boundaries? Is that what he might be most known for as a director?
Somewhat. He was a journeyman filmmaker, and by that I mean he worked in all sorts of genres. He did a film and then he moved on to the next thing. And he had done you know, action films and comedies and cop movies and melodramas and fantasy films. He'd worked in all sorts of different genres, and this was the thing that was lucrative at the time. And so he
Gotcha.
made the first film, Last Cannibal World, and that was a success. And so the producers said, "Let's do another one." He said, "Okay, but then let's do something a little bit different." And then that's how you get what ends up being Cannibal Holocaust.
I mean, he clearly was not looking for Hollywood respectability, correct?
No, no. Well, there's an interesting thing with the Italian filmmakers of this time, especially in the exploitation field, is that no, they weren't looking for Hollywood respectability, but they were chasing the American market. Most of
Right.
the Italian filmmakers were creating, at least in the sort of genre films, were making knockoffs of Hollywood films. But the cannibal movies are pretty specific to Italy compared to the other movies that they were making, knockoffs of Jaws and Star Wars and these kinds of things.
Right. Do you think that ultimately films like Cannibal Holocaust reveal to us the hypocrisy of our media, of our systems of power, right? That we are a society that is rife with exploitation,
Hmm.
right? Based on various categories, and we don't see it.
Yeah.
But then it's easy to look at this film and say, oh, there it is.
Yeah, in a way, that's one of the things that I think distinguishes Cannibal Holocaust is that in most of these kinds of movies, right, the civilized people go to the rural area and they're terrorized by rural people. And that's true not only of like Cannibal Holocaust, but also I Spit on Your Grave,
Yeah.
um, and Deliverance and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But what's interesting about Cannibal Holocaust is that it brings it back to New York City, and it uh, there's a connection between the boardroom and what was happening out in the field. There's a scene that I point to. I think it's one of the most important scenes in the movie when the anthropologist is sitting with the female network executive, and they're sitting eating lunch in a break between screening the reels of film, and the anthropologist says, I don't think this is all that extraordinary footage because this is people being terrorized into doing something they wouldn't normally do. To which the network executive says, who knows anything about, the Yakumo civilization? What people want is sensationalism. The more you rape their senses, the happier they are. Now, that's, aside from being kind of an extraordinary statement, it's also interesting because what happens a few scenes later, the documentarians gang rape a young Native woman.
Yes,
And so it's drawing a connection between the attitudes of the corporate office to what was happening in the field. And I think that's where Cannibal Holocaust really goes beyond what these other movies have done. It's pointing out the way in which not only industrialized society, but specifically corporate society is has done and continues to do in these parts of the world, in the way that they exploit these people. And I think it's particularly telling that it's set in South America. This is the place where the term Banana Republic comes from, right?
absolutely.
The history of exploitation from the United Fruit Company, now called Chiquita, and the way that they've done things. More recently, the controversy with Chevron and what happened there in Ecuador, the massive pollution that endangered indigenous people,
Mhm.
and other various political interference that has happened there for over a century.
Wow. Let's close this out, Nathan, by bringing it back to your time at UW Oshkosh. As I mentioned
Actually,
at the beginning, go ahead.
before we move on, there's one other
Yeah,
detail about that I think you'll find amusing.
sure.
If you look closely in the last scene, you can make out the address of the building that is the headquarters of the corporate office, right, of the network.
Hmm.
Today, that building is the headquarters of the Fox Corporation and News Corp.
Oh man, how perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So let's go back to your time at UW Oshkosh, and we'll close out on
Mm-hmm.
this. As I said earlier, you were a radio, TV, film major,
Yeah.
and you minored in English and philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that your education here really did, in a very real sense, prepare you to be able to write this type of book?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I happened into a media criticism class that was being taught there, and first expecting I'm going to write film reviews, and then like, no, this is actually looking at stuff in the same way that I was looking at literature in my English classes. I was like, oh, wait, we can do this, and that a light bulb went on. Like, oh, we can talk about media in the same sort of way, and so that was an enlightening experience. And then I think the English and philosophy, English obviously taught me how to write, but then also how to analyze texts, and gave me a lot of history in terms of the history of criticism as well as the history of literature. And then with philosophy, the whole point of philosophy is being able to learn how to think and how to take an argument apart and put it back together again.
Absolutely. And it's a very well written book. For
Thank you.
people watching, if you go to Amazon.com, you can get a sample of Nathan's introduction and chapter one. Maybe that might be enough to get you to purchase the entire book. And I plan on reading the whole thing, Nathan. It's just got a ton of insights that I never would have thought about on my
Mhm.
surface level watching of the film. So thank you so much for doing this interview. I appreciate it.
Good to be here. Thank you.
All right, cool.